The crystal wineglasses clinked as Eleanor Carrington topped off everyone's drinks, her flawless hostess smile never faltering. The monthly family dinner at the Carrington Estate was meticulously staged, a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and status, down to the precise tilt of Eleanor's chin as she glanced disdainfully at me, her son's wife of 3 years. "So, Laura," she said, swirling her wine with practiced grace, "are you still teaching at that little city college?" I dabbed my napkin gently at my lips before responding. "Actually, Eleanor, I'm a full professor now at Riverside State University. I was granted tenure last month." "Oh, how charming," Eleanor replied, exchanging subtle glances with her husband, Philip Carrington, CEO of Atlantic Fidelity Bank. "I suppose someone has to teach basic courses to freshmen." My husband, Daniel, squeezed my hand gently under the table. He was accustomed to these dinners, the thinly veiled insults and carefully masked contempt for my career. To the Carringtons, success was measured strictly by titles, in finance and banking. "Laura actually teaches advanced economics and international finance at the graduate level," Daniel clarified, though we both knew it would fall on deaf ears. Philip chuckled dismissively, slicing into his expertly grilled filet mignon. "International finance from a lecture hall? That's about as useful as studying sailing by reading a manual. Real banking, handling actual money. That's how you learn what drives economies." From across the table, my sister-in-law Victoria smirked smugly. As the newly appointed director of investments at Atlantic Fidelity, she relished reminding me of her superior position in the family's hierarchy. "Oh, speaking of real banking," Victoria chimed in sweetly, "Daddy, should we share the exciting news about our latest acquisition?" Philip's chest visibly expanded with pride. Atlantic Fidelity just acquired Northern State Bank, adding another $60 billion to our holdings. Now that's practical economics. "How wonderful," I murmured politely, sipping my wine to conceal my true thoughts. I'd already reviewed the internal reports on that very acquisition, but they didn't need to know, not yet. "You know, Laura," Eleanor leaned forward with feigned sympathy, "Daniel mentioned you've been spending a lot of late nights working. If teaching has become too demanding, perhaps Philip could find a nice administrative position for you at the bank. Entry level, of course." Daniel began to protest, but I touched his arm gently. "Thank you, Eleanor, but I'm actually quite occupied with my current research project for the Treasury Department." Victoria laughed openly. "Are you grading exams for them now, too?" I smiled evenly and shifted the conversation gracefully onto safer ground. Victoria's recent getaway to Tuscany, Philip's latest vintage car, Eleanor's upcoming charity gala. Let them speak freely. Let them assume. They had no idea who was really seated at their perfectly polished table. Later, as Daniel and I drove back to our modest townhouse, always a quiet disappointment to his family, he sighed heavily. "I'm sorry, Laura. They just don't know any better." "It's fine," I reassured him, glancing at my phone as another confidential email notification flashed across my screen. Sometimes, being underestimated has its advantages. He shook his head gently. "Still, I wish they could see the depth of your work, your true impact." I squeezed his hand warmly. Daniel was the only one who understood the full significance of my research, though even he didn't fully grasp the contents of the report I was finalizing. Back home, in my quiet study, I opened my laptop and returned to the document that had consumed my attention for the past 6 months. The official letterhead read clearly, "United States Treasury Special Committee on Financial Stability and Risk Management." As chief analyst and committee chair, I had been discreetly investigating systemic vulnerabilities within major regional banking institutions. It began as a routine evaluation, but what I uncovered had evolved into something far more consequential. The Carringtons, so proud and confident in their newest acquisition, were blissfully unaware of my meticulous documentation, detailing Atlantic Fidelity Bank's over-leveraged assets and precarious exposure. The report was nearly complete. Careful, precise, damning. In 2 weeks, when the Treasury released my findings publicly, Philip Carrington's carefully cultivated empire would crumble beneath the weight of its own arrogance. Until then, I'd let them savor their illusions, sipping wine in ignorance. Sometimes, The best lessons aren't taught in classrooms. They're delivered by reality itself. I had uncovered something far more alarming, particularly regarding some aggressively leveraged banks on the East Coast. My phone buzzed. A secure message from Jonathan Reed at the Treasury Department. Redicure Bennett. Preliminary findings confirm Atlantic Fidelity's exposure significantly worse than initial estimates. Urgent full assessment needed immediately. I quickly typed back. Agreed. Finalizing report now. Still set for Monday's meeting? Yes, 9 a.m. sharp. Full oversight committee required. Leaning back, I recalled Philip Carrington's boastful announcement about acquiring Northern State Bank. He had no clue the bank he'd proudly purchased was essentially a ticking financial bomb. Its assets were drastically overvalued, compounding Atlantic Fidelity's already dangerous leverage ratios. Another notification appeared, this time from Elena Rodriguez at the SEC. Identified those irregularities you flagged regarding the Northern State deal. Highly concerning. Review ASAP, sending secure link now. I replied promptly. Prioritize Section 9.2, Derivative Exposure and Valuation Methods. The night stretched on as I worked meticulously, refining each calculation. Every figure had to be flawless, each conclusion airtight. On Monday morning, I would enter the Treasury's regional headquarters not as Laura Bennett, the professor whose profession the Carringtons had dismissed, but as Dr. Laura Bennett, the country's foremost expert on financial system stability. I would reveal how their prestigious Atlantic Fidelity Bank was poised to trigger the most significant banking crisis since the Great Recession. My mind drifted back to Eleanor's condescending smirk, Victoria's sneering laughter, and Philip's arrogant dismissal of my academic knowledge. They presumed that teaching economics was disconnected from reality. They were about to experience firsthand how theory and practice could collide with devastating force. My phone buzzed one final time. A confirmation message from the Treasury Secretary's office regarding Monday's emergency session. I acknowledged swiftly and closed my laptop. Daniel was already asleep as I quietly slipped into bed beside him. Lying awake in the darkness, I wondered how the Carrington family would react when they discovered that the professor they'd overlooked was about to hold their financial future in her hands. Yet this wasn't about vengeance. It was about safeguarding the economy from precisely the reckless arrogance Philip Carrington had cultivated for years, believing his bank was untouchable, his status unchallengeable. Monday would alter everything. Still, a quiet human part of me looked forward to witnessing their stunned realization that the underestimated professor understood banking far better than they ever had. I drifted off to sleep, mentally rehearsing every detail of my presentation. In less than 48 hours, I'd stand before the most powerful financial regulators in the nation, and the Carringtons' illusions would crumble. I arrived at the Treasury's regional headquarters early, at 7:30 a.m. sharp, well ahead of the 9 a.m. meeting. The security guard recognized me immediately, offering a respectful nod without requesting my credentials. As chair of the Financial Stability Committee, I'd practically lived in this building for the past half year. Dr. Bennett, Jonathan Reed from the Treasury greeted me in the conference room, coffee in hand and a folder of his own notes ready. Glad you're early. The preliminary findings confirmed Atlantic Fidelity's exposure is even worse than we thought. We'll need a comprehensive evaluation immediately. I anticipated as much, I replied calmly, opening my files to the relevant section. I've prepared a full breakdown. Derivative risks alone are far beyond acceptable thresholds. We spent the next hour scrutinizing the finalized data. Jonathan's face turned increasingly grim with every page turned. At 8:45 a.m., Treasury Secretary Margaret Collins arrived, accompanied by senior officials from the Federal Reserve and the Oversight Committee members. Greetings were somber and brief, tension heavy in the air. Elijah Brooks, head of the Federal Reserve's Regional Supervision, spoke first. Dr. Bennett, are we ready? Yes, completely, I replied calmly, projecting an unwavering confidence that came from months of preparation. Margaret nodded firmly. Good. Then let's begin. I opened my presentation with precision, methodically unraveling Atlantic Fidelity's catastrophic financial position. The room fell silent, as my analysis exposed the gravity of their derivative exposure, reckless lending practices, and dangerously inflated valuations from the Northern State Bank acquisition. As I presented the indisputable evidence, I couldn't help but imagine the Carrington family's shock. They had dismissed me, thinking teaching economics rendered me naive to the complexities of banking. Now, theory and practice had collided, and it was time for accountability. The committee unanimously agreed immediate regulatory action was imperative. Atlantic Fidelity would be taken under federal control within hours. My work here wasn't about revenge, it was about justice, protecting the economy from reckless arrogance. But still, as the committee dispersed and the Treasury Secretary personally thanked me for my thorough investigation, I felt a quiet satisfaction. The Carringtons would finally grasp who truly understood real banking. And that, perhaps, was justice enough? Systematic misrepresentation in their risk assessments. Dr. Bennett, your model predicting their vulnerability was absolutely accurate. I nodded, pulling up my final presentation slides as other committee members filed into the conference room. Representatives from the FDIC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and various state banking regulators. At precisely 8:45 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from Daniel. Dad just received an urgent call, heading to Atlantic Fidelity HQ. Everything all right? I replied succinctly. Turn on CNBC in about an hour. At exactly 9 a.m., the large oak doors swung open and Philip Carrington marched in, flanked by his executive team and attorneys. His confident swagger faltered abruptly when his gaze met mine, seated at the head of the long conference table. Laura? Philip stammered, visibly startled. What? This must be some mistake. No mistake, Mr. Carrington, I responded evenly. Please, sit down. We have urgent matters to discuss. I was informed this was a Treasury Oversight Committee, he protested, glancing around in disbelief. Where's Secretary Collins? Secretary Collins is joining virtually. I gestured toward the large screen where her face, along with several others, appeared in solemn readiness. As committee chair, I'll be leading today's session. Philip's expression shifted swiftly, from confusion to disbelief and then to dawning realization and dread. The professor he'd so casually dismissed was now presiding over his fate. For those just joining us, I began, my voice steady and authoritative. I am Dr. Laura Bennett, Chair of the Treasury's Special Committee on Financial Stability and Risk Management. We are here to discuss grave concerns regarding Atlantic Fidelity Bank, especially following its recent acquisition of Northern State Bank. I clicked forward to the first slide, a detailed yet simplified chart showing Atlantic Fidelity's complex web of risk exposure. Even simplified, it elicited audible gasps throughout the room. Our 6-month investigation uncovered persistent patterns of risky practices, I continued. Atlantic Fidelity's actual leverage ratio is over 40% higher than publicly reported, primarily due to significant hidden exposure in the derivatives market. Philip's attorney attempted to interrupt, but I calmly raised my hand. Please hold your questions until the end. There's much to cover. For the next hour, I meticulously detailed the troubling facts we discovered. Creative accounting practices, obscuring true risk levels, inflated asset valuations from the Northern State acquisition, and dangerous derivative positions capable of triggering systemic fallout across numerous financial institutions. In conclusion, I said firmly, advancing to the final slide, Atlantic Fidelity's present position poses an unacceptable risk to the entire financial system. This committee therefore recommends immediate regulatory intervention, including a temporary suspension of trading in Atlantic Fidelity stock, a restructuring of executive leadership, and a comprehensive audit of all holdings. Philip finally recovered enough composure to protest. This is absurd. You can't possibly have that authority. You're just a professor. Dr. Bennett, Secretary Collins interjected from the large screen, her tone sharp, is one of our most esteemed experts on financial risk. Her models accurately predicted vulnerabilities leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, and they're currently standard curriculum at Wharton and Harvard. Perhaps, if you had attended one of her annual seminars at Treasury, you'd understand. My phone was vibrating constantly now. News had broken publicly. Daniel sent another quick message. Mom and Victoria watching CNBC. Your name just appeared as Treasury Committee Chair. Mom dropped her coffee mug. The hours that followed blurred into intense discussions, legal maneuvering, and increasingly frantic attempts by Philip and his team to avoid the inevitable consequences. By late afternoon, Atlantic Fidelity's stock had plunged more than 60%. Philip sat slumped at the table, the fight drained from his once proud demeanor. Eleanor's earlier disdain and Victoria's arrogance felt distant, petty. This wasn't personal. It was about accountability and protecting the economy from unchecked recklessness. I gathered my notes and rose from the table. Secretary Collins thanked me warmly, recognizing my meticulous work. The regulators and committee members dispersed swiftly to begin implementing immediate safeguards. As I left the conference room, my phone buzzed again, Daniel's message making me smile softly. "Proud of you, Laura. Looks like everyone finally learned who really understands banking." Stepping outside into the crisp evening air, I exhaled deeply. Justice had been served. Not through vengeance, but through expertise and integrity. Sometimes, simply doing your job exceptionally well is enough to change everything. I had been suspended as CEO, and federal regulators had swiftly installed an interim management team. I gathered my materials as the room slowly emptied, regulators and lawyers splitting into smaller groups to address various aspects of the intervention. Philip Carrington remained seated, his gaze fixed blankly on the polished surface of the conference table. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" he finally asked, his voice weary and hollow. "All those family dinners. Why didn't you warn us?" "Would it have mattered, Philip?" I replied softly. "Would you have listened to my concerns about your risk practices?" He stared silently, offering no reply. We both knew the answer. That evening, I returned home to find Daniel waiting in the kitchen with a glass of wine and a proud smile. "You were incredible today," he said warmly, holding up his phone. Clips from various financial news outlets displayed headlines about the dramatic regulatory intervention spearheaded by banking expert Dr. Laura Bennett. "How's your family handling it?" I asked, cautiously. He chuckled lightly. "Mom called 5 times trying to convince me she always knew you were brilliant, claiming she was just trying to push you toward your full potential. Victoria hasn't said a single word, but she quietly removed all mentions of her role at Atlantic Fidelity from social media." I sighed, stepping out of my heels and sinking onto the sofa. This isn't how I wanted things to turn out. The issues at the bank were genuine. Intervention was necessary. "I know," Daniel responded gently, taking my hand. "And that's why what you did matters even more. You acted because it was right, not out of vengeance." My phone vibrated once again, a message from Elena Rodriguez at the SEC. Preliminary audit results even more troubling than anticipated. Immediate intervention was the right call. Over the following weeks, the full extent of Atlantic Fidelity's problems surfaced. Leading financial publications published detailed analyses highlighting how a respected academic had identified systemic risks overlooked by traditional regulators. The Harvard Business Review requested an article on my analytical approach, and multiple major banks began implementing my risk assessment models through top consulting firms. Predictably, the Carringtons' monthly dinner stopped abruptly. But 2 weeks after the intervention, Eleanor Carrington appeared unexpectedly at my university office. She stood awkwardly by the door, absorbing the numerous awards, published research articles, and photographs of me alongside Federal Reserve and Treasury officials. She began hesitantly, then cleared her throat. "I'm sorry, Laura, we underestimated you in so many ways." Gesturing to the chair across from me, I replied, "Banking isn't simply about profits, Eleanor. It's about understanding complex systems, identifying patterns, managing risk. That's precisely what I teach and research." She nodded slowly, eyes lowered. "Philip always insisted your academic knowledge had no place in real banking. Now he's barred from the industry, and you're advising the Treasury Secretary herself." Leaning forward slightly, I offered, "Would you like to hear what I'm working on now?" Eleanor looked up, surprised. "You'd be willing to tell me?" "I'm developing new frameworks to strengthen community banks, strategies to enhance stability and competitiveness," I explained earnestly. "Banking should focus on serving communities and promoting sustainable growth, not just chasing profits and risk." She paused thoughtfully. "Could you share more?" For the next hour, I outlined my research and proposals, genuinely impressed, as Eleanor posed thoughtful, insightful questions. By the end, something fundamental had shifted between us. As she stood to leave, Eleanor hesitated briefly. "You know, we're thinking of restarting the family dinners. At a smaller home, obviously. Would you and Daniel consider coming?" I smiled warmly. "I'd like that, perhaps with less discussion about banking this time." She actually laughed, a genuine relaxed laugh I'd never heard from her before. Definitely fewer banking topics. 1 year later, I sat comfortably in my office at the Treasury Department, dividing my time evenly between regulatory work and teaching. On my office wall hung a framed copy of the Harvard Business Review cover, "The Professor Who Predicted the Crisis: How Academic Rigor is Transforming Financial Oversight." My phone buzzed, a text from Daniel reminding me about tonight's family dinner. These days, the conversations around the Carrington family table had genuinely transformed. Gone were the subtle insults and dismissive glances. Instead, our discussions revolved around personal stories, shared laughter, and even Eleanor's latest community outreach project. As I prepared to leave, I paused briefly, reflecting on the past year's events. I had never intended revenge or vindication. I had simply performed my duty. Yet in doing so, I'd not only reshaped banking oversight, but also built bridges where none seemed possible. And perhaps, I thought, that was the true measure of success, changing minds through integrity, diligence, and genuine commitment to doing what was right. Victoria had found a surprising new passion, leading a nonprofit dedicated to microfinance initiatives in underserved communities. Philip, humbled and wiser, was now teaching business ethics at a local community college. Eleanor had become one of my most enthusiastic partners in promoting financial literacy programs. As I packed my belongings to head home, I reflected on what I always told my graduate students at the start of each semester. Banking isn't about power or prestige. It's about understanding how money moves through interconnected systems, shaping everyday lives. Often, the deepest insights come not from chasing deals, but from carefully studying theories behind them. Now, my students listen intently, especially since the Atlantic Fidelity case study had become part of the standard curriculum. Walking to my car, I passed students discussing my latest published research. Spotting me, one nudged the others, and their conversation halted abruptly, faces anxious yet curious. "Don't let me interrupt," I smiled gently, "though if you're debating derivative exposure calculations, I'd be glad to explain my methods." Their eyes brightened instantly, and we dove into animated discussion. After all, true expertise wasn't about titles or family connections. It was about knowledge, integrity, and making things better for everyone. If you've been inspired by my journey, I genuinely appreciate your support. Please share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your feedback and personal reflections. Did you find inspiration in my experience standing firm against those who underestimated me? Have you ever faced situations where others questioned your worth or expertise? Let's connect in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories, your insights, and any advice you'd give someone navigating similar challenges. Your encouragement and feedback means so much, especially knowing many of us face times when others underestimate us. My journey was never about revenge. It was about doing what was right despite opposition, misunderstanding, or disrespect. Have you experienced moments when simply doing your job well turned out to be your greatest strength? How did you handle being underestimated, and what wisdom can you share? Let's discuss how perseverance and integrity can lead to meaningful success, even when the world doubts you. Lastly, I encourage you to apply these lessons to your own life. Remember that true success doesn't hinge on titles, status, or approval from others. It's rooted in integrity, knowledge, and perseverance. When faced with opposition, stay grounded in your expertise and values. Use the doubts of others as motivation to grow stronger, smarter, and more resilient. Most importantly, never shy away from standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or unpopular. By doing so, you'll not only prove your critics wrong, you'll prove yourself right in the best possible way, by making a difference. Thank you for supporting my journey, and I'm cheering you on in yours.